I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today, the conclusion of our investigation to the mysterious death of Elisa Lam. Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of the Prosecutors Podcast. Today, we're going to finish our discussion of the mysterious death of Elisa Lam. My name is Brett, and I'm your host today, and I'm joined by my lovely, wonderful co-host, Alice.
Hey, everybody.
And Alice, I don't know if our podcast is cursed, if we built the studio on an ancient Indian burial ground, or what, but man, the hits just keep on coming. First, of course, it was the coronavirus, which everybody's dealing with. You know, we did our first episode together, and then since then, we've been in this quarantine, so Alice has been stuck in her closet. And now today, I'm not in the studio. I am actually broadcasting from underneath a blanket, and you may ask yourself why, and it's because a tree fell on my house.
Wait, and when Brett says a tree fell on his house, we're talking like straight out of a cartoon when an anvil falls on a piano type of situation. The tree didn't just fall on your house. The tree smashed your house.
The tree basically cut the house in half. It was a very large tree. I mean, we're talking like a 120-year-old pine tree, probably 100 feet tall. Who knows how much it weighed. We were having a storm. I was awake when it happened. We were in the living room. And, we have a lot of storms in this area, and I didn't think it was any big deal. There was a lot of lightning. There was some wind. And there had just been a lightning flash, and my dog hates thunder. So I said to him, you better watch out. We're about to have a big boom. And man, I was not lying. I wasn't wrong, because when that tree hit our house, it was like a bomb went off. I mean, I've never been in an earthquake, but I've got to imagine it's got to be something like that. I mean, the house was shaking. Stuff was falling from the ceiling. I ran into the back and grabbed the baby, and we're heading to the basement, and all of a sudden, power transformers are exploding outside there, and like these blue flashes of light. I mean, it was like the end of the world. But I got to tell you, the first thought was save the baby. The second thought was, oh my goodness, what happened to the podcast equipment?
Are you guys okay, though?
Oh, we're fine. We're fine. And turns out, so was all the podcasting equipment, which, like I said, was my second thought. So literally, while the storm is still raging outside, there's a massive hole in my roof. There's a tree in my house. People pay a lot of money for that. There's, shingles and all kinds of stuff falling in, and I'm crawling through that stuff so I can get up to where the podcast studio is, because I want to know, is the podcast equipment still intact? And by the grace of God or something, I don't know, there it was, away from the rain, away from the tree, intact. Studio's seen better days, so I may be recording from underneath a blanket for a while, trying to prevent echo.
Well, the studio is kind of no more.
Yeah.
Well, I can confirm that story, too. While the storm was going on, I did get a text from Brett that said, hole in house, podcast equipment safe. So he had his priorities straight. I obviously followed up with, how are your kids and dog and your wife?
Well, like I said, we saved the podcasting equipment first. Oh, wait, no, it's the other way around. We saved the family first, and then we saved the podcasting equipment. So my priorities were in the right place.
All we're saying is we are committed to this podcast.
We are. And hopefully the audience, to the extent we even have an audience at this point, will give us a pass on any bizarre audio hiccups we have. I noticed as I was editing yesterday's podcast, you can hear the bells from the church across the street from my house. So sorry about that. If you're a stickler for that sort of thing, I'll try and get better.
So to set the scene for all of you guys, Brett is huddled under a blanket with a hole in his house still, speaking into a microphone that was saved by the grace of God somehow. And I am still sitting in my closet with headphones on, because we are still sheltering in place in our respective houses. So this is quite the setup.
That is the life we live now. That's our podcast life recording experience. I think the experience of recording this podcast may be more interesting than the podcast itself.
Well, you came for the true crime. Maybe you'll stay for the drama.
Exactly. If this true crime podcast doesn't work out, we'll record a podcast about recording a podcast. It'll be very meta.
I like that one. I would listen to it.
So having said all that and preparing you guys for any troubles we may run into in this recording session, today we're going to finish the investigation into the death of Elisa Lam. Like I said, I promise we're actually going to finish today. And I think the things that we're going to talk about today may be the most interesting things that we discuss in this investigation, just because they're things that people don't know about. You know, the most important thing I think we covered in day one, and that's Elisa Lam's struggle with mental illness. The second day, you know, we watched the video together. We talked about some of these strange synchronicities that we see and, you know, these coincidences that people find so fascinating about this case. Today, we're turning to those depositions we've been talking about. Those depositions that were taken as a part of a civil lawsuit that was filed by Elisa Lam's parents after her body was discovered in the water tower. This lawsuit was filed against the Cecil Hotel, and, you know, these depositions, I think, shed a lot of light on this case. And there are things in those depositions that I did not know, things that I had not seen. There were things that I knew about, but I didn't know the details of. So those are the kind of things we want to talk about today. So like I said, we talked about synchronicities. Now I want to move on to some more of the hard facts we have. I want to talk a little bit about these depositions. And then I want to get to our theory of this and what we think happened. So the first deposition, well, this case, I'll go ahead and tell you the name and the case number in case you want to look it up. It's David Lam et al. Versus Cecil Hotel Management Incorporated. The case number, and this is once again in Los Angeles County, BC 521927. And you have to have that number to look up the case. So if you want to try and get into these documents yourself, other than the ones that we're going to put online, and if you do go, you do have to pay for anything else you want to get. So better to use ours for free, but you will need that case number. And as Alice said earlier, there was a lawsuit and several depositions were taken. One of them was the lead detective on the case, a Wallace Tennell. And this was the guy who investigated this case. He was in charge of this case. If anybody knew about this case, it was him. If there was anyone who had a reason to suspect a murder had been committed, it was him. And, you know, thinking back, if you have biases against the police, in a case like this, the police would want there to be a crime. Yeah, this is the kind of case that makes Wallace Tennell's career. It's a famous case, publicity everywhere. You find the killer, you put him away. He's, you know, doing television shows for the rest of his life. So he had every incentive to see a crime here, and he didn't. And when you look at the deposition, you see that. So a couple things that he talked about, and we're going to look at some specific things as well. When people talk about this case, they talk about the stairwell that led to the roof of the hotel. And they talk about the fact that that stairwell has an alarm on it. And when you read these depositions, you'll see depositions from the hotel manager, from the hotel engineer, from people who worked at the hotel, and from Tennell. They all say that that alarm was working. And they all say that if you open that door, everybody on the 14th floor would hear it, and it rings an alarm in the lobby. And there's no evidence that an alarm ever went off. But there are fire escapes that are accessible by opening a window at the end of the hotel corridors. There are no alarms there. You open that window, you go on to the fire escape, and you can either walk all the way up or you can walk all the way down. And we know that Elisa Lam, her hotel room was on the 5th floor. It was only a couple rooms down from that window. So it's certainly possible that what Elisa Lam would have done is go to the end of that hallway, open that window, and walk up the fire escape to the roof. Another thing, when you read Detective Tennell's deposition, that undermines what a lot of people talk about in this case. The hatch itself, it was heavy. It weighed around 20 pounds. A lot of people say that it's not likely that Elisa could have lifted the hatch and opened it. Now, the hatch is currently on hinges, so she would have to do that. But that's new. That is something that the hotel did to ameliorate the risk. They also put a padlock on these doors. At the time, it was a simple slide opening. So all you had to do was push this opening over to the side, it would slide, and then you have the open hatch. So that, to me at least, seems like a much easier thing to do than to have to actually lift the 20-pound opening.
And another thing that we find out, I think this is the first time we find out, and it's through these depositions, is it's the first time we hear about two men who are with Elisa. So the detective in this case testified in the deposition that we did see her enter eventually. We did see her come in with two gentlemen. They had a box, gave it to her. She went up to the elevator. They left. We never saw them again on video. So I just read to you the quote. You can go read it yourself as well. What's frustrating is this is the first time we ever hear about these two men, and that's it. There isn't follow-up as to what day this was. Was this the first day that she was in the hotel? Was this the day she disappeared? What did these gentlemen look like? What did the box, was it a big box, a small box, a takeout box, a gift box, a shoe box? And then how long, he says that they left. We don't know how long they were there. Did they stay there? Was it friendly? Did it look like they knew each other? We have just no idea about anything. And this goes back to what I said previously about depositions not being like investigative interviews that law enforcement do with witnesses. This is the attorney for Elisa's parents who is conducting the deposition. And clearly, by the fact that they are bringing this civil lawsuit for damages against the hotel, tells you that they're not interested in characterizing her disappearance as a crime or a murder, but rather as negligence on the part of the hotel. So it makes sense from really a lawyer's perspective not to spend your time going down a rabbit hole of who these two men are, because it has nothing to do with this civil lawsuit against the hotel. But from our perspective of trying to understand what happened to her, this is incredibly frustrating. I want to know more about these two men. It could have been completely innocuous. It really could have been, takeout. Probably not, because if you're picking up takeout, people don't usually follow you. But, are these people that she met on the train when she was taking this long Amtrak train ride down the coast? And, sometimes you make friends along the way and they parted ways. Maybe they were going somewhere else and they were helping her carry something that was hers. Maybe they weren't even giving her a box. We don't know. I think if a lot could be told about how you interact with someone, whether it's the first time you've seen them, they're strangers, pleasantries, or you've had more of a history with them. Brett, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think this is as unusual almost as the video in the elevator. I think it blew my mind when I read this in the transcript, and I had not seen it anywhere else before. Now, after I read the transcript and I started trying to do some research on these two men, other people had talked about this a little bit online, though it's not something that normally comes up, I think because most people don't have access to the transcripts, and so it's just not been a part of the story that people have focused on. But it doesn't make any sense, really, especially when you consider all the other aspects of the Elisa Lam case. We've talked about this. Elisa Lam was on her own. She was a loner. She wasn't somebody who necessarily wanted to be around people a lot. And yet here she is walking into the lobby of this hotel with two quote unquote gentlemen, as the detective said, and they have a box and they gave her the box and she took the box and they left and we never see them again. And nobody follows up on this at all. And we don't have this video. We don't even know if this video still exists. We know that Detective Tennille saw it, but we don't know that it was pulled because the police may have not have thought it was that significant, and it may not be significant. We don't know how these men were dressed. In my mind, I sort of go off on these wild tangents where they're dressed like the Men in Black or that Matt Damon movie, The Adjustment Bureau, I think it's called, where they're wearing suits and felt hats. That's probably not what they were wearing in this box. What is this box? Presumably, if it were takeout, the detective would have said something like she ordered takeout. And he doesn't say that. He talks about, once again, they had a box and that's all we get. And they gave her the box. It's just utterly bizarre. And we're going to talk about our theories in this case. And I think at the end of the day, these two guys don't have anything to do with it. But this, to me, is going to be an unanswered question that will never be answered unless these two people come forward one day and explain what this interaction was. And if that has happened and somebody knows and it's on some obscure part of the internet that I didn't see, please let us know, because this is really, really weird.
And I'd like to add something too. All along what we've heard about Elisa and the story about her is that she's this loner. Typically, a loner probably wouldn't just strike up conversation with two random people, right? I mean, I tend to do that, but I know I am more of an extrovert, so it's not weird for me to just strike up conversation with a stranger. But if in
Well, even if
fact
you did strike up conversation, would you take something from them?
probably not. I'd probably have to know them a lot better to take something from them. But this just kind of goes against with the whole thing that she's traveling alone. If she's going up to the roof because she doesn't want to run into people, but she wants to see LA, that she blogs that she really should leave her room more often. I mean, it all seems like she is a loner. But then these two people, I mean, it seems uncharacteristic for her. And for it not to be followed up on, I think is very strange.
It is strange. It's hard to say it's anything other than strange. And it's possible that the police did follow up on it in some way that just wasn't mentioned in the deposition. As you said, this is not a full investigation. Police officers in particular are reticent to give more information than what they are asked. They are trained to be that way. It's the way they are on the stand, particularly with a hostile attorney. They answer the question that's asked of them. They do not necessarily just go into extra detail. So for all we know, the police did investigate this. They found the two guys. They figured out they were completely unrelated. And had a follow-up question been asked, he would have said that. But he doesn't say that, and so we don't know. The next thing I want to talk about, this is really, we mentioned this from Detective Tennille's deposition, and that's the roof access. But I also want to talk about the depositions of other people that are really never mentioned. One of them is Amy Price, who was a manager at the Cecil. The other one was Pedro Tovar, who was the chief engineer. These people were both deposed as part of this. And the theory that Elisa Lam's parents were working under was that the hotel did not do enough to secure that roof and secure the water tanks to ensure that something like this didn't happen. Essentially, in the final order by the judge, which I did not download, so if you want to read that, you'll have to pull it yourself. But essentially what they said was this was not foreseeable. It was not foreseeable that someone would do this, and so the hotel didn't have any liability. I don't know that I totally agree with that based on some of these depositions, because I think the defense attorney did a pretty good job of showing that roof access at the Cecil Hotel was really easy. And this debunks a lot of the theories that people have online. The whole basis that a lot of people have for a hotel employee having done this was that the only way you could get through that alarm door was with a key. If you had a hotel key, as one of the employees, you could disable the alarm and you could go on the roof. Turns out people were on that roof all the time. When they talked to Amy Price, she would go up there because she had to show investors, business people, the roof. I don't know if the Cecil Hotel was going to be sold. Apparently it is under new management now, because now it's the Stay on Main. They've changed the name to try and avoid some of its infamy. But she would take people up there, and she reported they would find graffiti, and they would find new graffiti. And we know that there's graffiti because we talked about the graffiti earlier that was up there. And as we said, even if that one tag was related to Elisa Lam's death, the one that was tagged 2012 wasn't. So somebody was going up there and they were able to spray paint graffiti without the hotel staff knowing. But it wasn't just that. Pedro Tovar testified that every few months he would happen to be up there when other people were up there. He would find people who were taking pictures. It was a good place to take pictures of Los Angeles, which goes to what we were talking about earlier about the possibility that Elisa Lam was up there for sightseeing. He would find people up there drinking. And it's pretty obvious that what people were doing is they were climbing out those windows, walking up the fire escape to the roof and hanging out on the roof. And for every time that Pedro Tovar found someone, there were 10 times when he didn't. And he said this happened where he would find people every few months. So the idea that it was difficult to get to this roof, or that the fact that Elisa ended up on the roof shows that someone must have taken there, it's just not true. And it's debunked by these depositions and by the testimony of people who worked at the hotel.
So I'll push back just a little. So I agree with you that the defense did a really good job of, or I'm sorry, Elisa's parents' lawyers did a really good job of showing that, in fact, the hotel knew of this problem of people getting up on the roof without triggering an alarm. But I think I agree with the judge to side with the hotel here because I don't think they've ever talked about anyone having access to the hatch to get into the water tank and anyone playing on the water tank or trying to get into the water tank or some dare to get themselves wedged into this 18 by 18 opening because like we said yesterday, you can't really trip and fall into that. You have to really go like feet first or head first in. You have to be vertical rather than horizontal to get in. And so I think if Elisa's death had been something like falling off the roof, then I could see that where there was negligence by the hotel because they knew people could go on the roof, and maybe I have no idea what the roof looks like, but maybe the roof didn't have a barrier so you could trip and fall off the roof. But if we're talking about more specifically the water tank on the roof, I do think the judge was right in saying that they couldn't have foreseen this.
To support you in that, the lawyers for the defense, the lawyers for the hotel, that was something they really focused on. And in declarations signed by Mr. Tovar and Ms. Price, they actually make those points that in the entire time they were working there, they knew of no instance in which anyone climbed on top of the water tanks or ended up in the water tanks or had done anything related to the water tanks. And that was a real focus of the hotel, that even if going up on the roof was foreseeable, this with the water tanks was completely unforeseeable. And that is essentially why they won.
And this supports how the police did their investigation. I know a lot of people might say, well, the police didn't search thoroughly enough. They did search the roof, and that makes sense if they were talking to the hotel staff who say, well, sometimes people can get up on the roof. But they didn't search the water tank, as far as we know. And that would make sense because the staff may say, oh, no one goes up there. You have to climb a ladder to get up there. But, sometimes kids do come up here and, tag graffiti up here. So that's kind of a vote in favor of the police doing at the time what they thought was a thorough job.
I think one of the most interesting things from these depositions comes from Amy Price's deposition. You often see in stories written about Elisa Lam's disappearance that she was originally in a communal room with a number of other people, and at some point they asked her to leave because of strange behavior. And at that point, the Cecil Hotel moved her into a single room. But you rarely see any details about what she was doing. And in the deposition, Ms. Price was actually asked what sort of behavior was going on in that room. We also learned that the room was a shared room with 8 people. So there were a number of people, and she was in the second bed in that room. And this is how Ms. Price describes her behavior. She says her behavior was strange. She was posting Post-it notes on people's beds and asking them to leave. The Post-it notes said, "Please leave." When her roommates would try and enter the dormitory room, she would ask for a password, and she had several outbursts in the lobby where she actually said that she was crazy. Now, Ms. Price does not elaborate on those outbursts beyond that. But at some point, after these outbursts, after asking her roommates for a password, after putting Post-it notes on their beds, asking them to leave, the Cecil Hotel took action and they moved Elisa Lam to another room that was also on the 5th floor, but was a room she had to herself. So when you take all this together, I think you come to what our theory is of this. And I think we're in agreement. I don't want to speak for Alice. If
Yeah,
Alice
no, I
disagrees.
think we talked a lot about what we think this is. And well, first, let's talk about from a prosecutor angle. So we've talked through a lot of the evidence. We've even read some depositions, which depositions typically happen only in civil cases, but, we'll kind of treat them as if they were witness interviews. What would you bring this case, Brett, if you were a prosecutor against, I'm not sure who?
I think that's the problem. I thought about having us walk through the best case scenario for this being a crime, for her having been murdered. And it is very difficult to do. You're basically just making things up. There's no suspect. There's no way to know. Look, if Elisa Lam was suffering from a mental breakdown, is it possible a serial killer found her and took advantage of it? Sure. Serial killers, they're predators. They call them predators for a reason. They look for weak people. They look for easy targets. And if she was exhibiting some of these problems, I think they could have seen that. But the problem is, I don't even know what evidence you would point to when you're going to a grand jury to even try and get an indictment in this case. It really doesn't make any sense. Even the fact that her body is in the water tank. If someone wanted to kill her, why not just kill her in her room? Particularly if it was someone who she didn't know or who was not associated with her. You kill her in her room, you leave her there, and you get out of Dodge. And whenever they find the body, it's going to be very hard to attach it to you. Much more dangerous to take her up to the roof where any number of people could have seen you commit this crime, where any number of people could stumble upon you, and then put her in this water tank. It's such a unusual thing to do, and it doesn't even really make sense as a crime. So I don't know how you could bring this case.
And to break it down, what would this caption even look like for a legal case? The city of Los Angeles versus blank. And you just can't bring that type of a case. I agree with you with the evidence that we see here. There's not enough evidence that there was a crime that was committed. And if you were to bring a case, it's not even clear who you'd bring it against. There's not even a list of likely suspects.
And once again, if you want to take the worst possible view of these prosecutors and these police, this is a career-making case, both for a prosecutor and for a police officer. If there were any evidence whatsoever that she was murdered, they would do everything they could to bring this case. Because if you get a conviction here, you're making national news. So we say we trust police officers, but if there's those of you out there who don't, take the worst possible view of this then. There's no reason for them to cover this up or not follow up. Detective Tennille, he's a homicide detective. He's going to have, it's not like not following up on this means he gets to leave early and go fishing. He's got a limited number of cases, particularly in Los Angeles. If anything, this is the kind of case he would want to spend some time on. So it's really hard to see a crime here. And there's really not any evidence that a crime was committed. At the conclusion of his deposition, the detective was asked what his theory was of what happened to Miss Lam. And if he had any suspicion of foul play, this was his opportunity to say, this is what he said. My opinion is that she fell off her medication, and in her state, she happened to find her way onto the roof, got into the tank of water. At the time, I think that the water tank was maybe full. But as people used water, unknown to her, the level was dropping to a point where she could no longer reach out and escape, and she died that way. And that's a terrible theory. It's difficult to imagine anything worse than that. But that was what the lead detective on this case thought happened.
So with that said, then, no one wants to be left with a question mark. And there are lots of theories out there. And Brett and I have talked a lot about this, what we think actually happened, and we've been consistent throughout the last couple of days talking about this case, and I think you know where we're headed. But I do think it's likely that our theory probably makes sense. And why don't you take it away, Brett?
So I think we've made it fairly evident that we think this had to do with Elisa Lam's mental illness. We're going to flesh that out a little bit. One thing people say online, and they probably have as much experience with bipolar disorder as I do. Would bipolar disorder lead to this? My understanding is untreated bipolar disorder can lead to sort of psychotic breaks where you could see something like this. But I think if you look at Elisa Lam, there's some other things that might be going on here. We talked earlier about the fact that Elisa Lam was on a number of drugs. Now, this is speculation on our part, but I'm going to throw it out in there. I'm going to throw it out there anyway. I think it's possible that Elisa Lam simply suffered from some sort of psychotic break. It could have been related from the fact that she was taking her medication inconsistently. It could have been related to the fact that at least one of her medications, it appears she had stopped taking. She could have been suffering from withdrawals from that. But I also think it's possible that she was suffering from something called serotonin syndrome. In preparation for this podcast, I read a lot about these drugs, and one of the things that I kept coming up on was a side effect, and each drug had this side effect, and it's serotonin syndrome. And the symptoms of this include agitation, hallucinations, fever, sweating, shivering, fast heart rate, muscle stiffness, twitching, loss of coordination, and in fact can lead to death in really bad situations. Now, serotonin syndrome almost never occurs with the use of one antidepressant drug. But when you combine antidepressant drugs, the chances of having serotonin syndrome increase. And the more drugs you're taking, the more dramatically this increases. We're going to include a few papers that I found talking about serotonin syndrome, and they really lay out the fact that multiple prescriptions of drugs happen a lot. Some of these papers actually argue against that on the basis of serotonin syndrome. It's very difficult to find serotonin syndrome, particularly in an autopsy, and people think that it's vastly underreported, the occurrences of serotonin syndrome. So I think it's possible that she was actually suffering from that. And I think if she was suffering from that, it explains a lot of the things we've seen. And of course, the test that you would use to determine whether or not someone had serotonin syndrome is the serotonin Elisa, for those of you into the synchronicities. So yeah, I think Elisa Lam probably suffered a psychotic break. And when you look at the evidence, all the evidence we have, that's what it points to. And it's not just the elevator, though the elevator behavior is unusual. As we discussed earlier, Elisa was showing evidence that something was wrong. She was showing evidence that something was wrong when she was in the room with the other people, the hostel style room. So when you have multiple instances where someone is having a mental issue, the thing that probably happened here was she had a mental issue. And one other thing that's interesting from the autopsy report. If you read the autopsy report, you'll find that Elisa Lam's clothes had
just like fine dust on it, right? Like a sand or something.
Right. It reads, sand and small, flat, white, and fragile flecks of unknown material. That's what the detective described it as. In the autopsy report, it's described as sand-like particulate attached to the fabric and loosely present in the fold of the clothes. What a lot of people think that is what you put on top of the roof of a building, which is basically sand, it's a gravel, it's a silicate material. Some people try and use that as evidence that Elisa Lam was murdered, and that somebody threw her down on the ground, and that she got that stuff on her clothes that way.
But like we said earlier, there's just no evidence that she was thrown down with any type of physical trauma, right?
Right. There's no trauma. There's nothing that would indicate that someone put her on the ground. No bruising, no cuts, no abrasions, nothing. So I think the more likely thing that you have here, I think Elisa Lam was spending time on that roof. I think on that night, she climbed the fire escape stairs, something she had done at this point many times before. She came to the roof, a place where she'd come to feel comfortable, and she decided to lay down. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she wanted to look up at the stars over Los Angeles. After a while, it was time to go, but when she got up, she realized she was covered in sand. And what do when you're covered in sand? You wash it off. Elisa didn't have any water, but she knew where to get some. She'd seen the water towers before. Maybe she'd even climbed up and looked inside of them. Now she decided to use them. That's one possible scenario. We'll never know how much of it, if any of it, is accurate. But this we do know, and we know it for sure. Even if Elisa Lam were murdered, on the night she died, she was suffering from a recurrence of mental illness. Maybe it was a result of not properly medicating herself. Maybe it was serotonin syndrome. Maybe it was a side effect from the drugs she was taking, or a withdrawal symptom from the one she had stopped taking. But whatever the cause, she was in the grip of it that night. We have a mountain of evidence that that was the case. She struggled with mental illness her whole life. Amy Price testified to multiple incidents of bizarre behavior in the hotel lobby. Her roommates testified to her inexplicable behavior in their shared room. And we have the video from the elevator on the very night she disappeared. And against that mountain of evidence, we have nothing pointing to the existence of a killer. A boogeyman put Elisa Lam in that water tower that night, but he lived in her own mind.
So Brett, I like you said, we really don't know what happened, and I think your theory is actually one of the best I've heard, especially explaining why that sand was on her body, or on her clothes, I should say. And I think it's very possible that may have happened. I'd like to give maybe another theory. Rather than being alone, I think it's possible that maybe someone was there with her. And I say this for a couple of reasons. I agree with you that there's no evidence that someone forced her up to that roof, up that ladder, or into the water tank. Because like we said, crimes are messy. She has barely a bruise on her body, and that's really difficult to force someone into a water tank without leaving some mark. So I don't think that someone physically forced her. But what we've discussed a lot already is that she was clearly mentally fragile at this point. We don't know if it's from having a mental break, or maybe just taking her drugs in the wrong, not as prescribed. That could be it. But I think that someone may have been up there with her. And I say this because we know that she was seen with two men. I'm not saying it's those two men, but we know she's been seen with those two men. We know that, one of the last people to see her was a bookstore employee who, she had some interaction with. And we know that she had been in a hostel room with roommates, 7 or 8 other people, and probably made enemies there. They may not have known that she was having a mental break. For all they knew, she was a weird person or a mean person, telling them to leave, probably freaking them out a little bit. And I can imagine someone can recognize that Elisa is vulnerable mentally and susceptible to being manipulated. I can imagine maybe some dumb kids, dumb teenagers, thinking they were just playing around, daring her to do something like get into a water tank, never thinking that a sane person would do that. So I think she ultimately was the one who got into that water tank, but I'm not positive that she was completely alone. Because we do have some evidence of her being around other people while she is a loner. Based on her blog posts online, I think she wanted to be around other people. So I don't think she was necessarily trying to isolate herself from others. It was more an effect of what she was suffering from. She was isolated because maybe of some of the mental issues she was going through, but I don't think she actually wanted to be alone. So if someone showed interest in her and wanted seemingly to be a friend or to talk to her, I think she seems like a friendly person. She probably would have gone along with it. And to me, that may begin to explain some of that elevator video we see. That's the last time we see her. She does seem to be talking to someone. Again, maybe it's a mental break, but maybe she is talking to someone. Maybe that person knows that there's a camera there. They don't want to be caught. They're just playing around. They're not trying to kill anyone. They are just maybe mad she left a mean Post-it note, maybe thinking she's a little bit weird. Maybe they're bored. Maybe they're smoking pot, and just wanting to have a little fun, and it goes terribly wrong. So while I think she crawls into the water tank herself, I think it is possible someone else may have encouraged her to do so.
And I think that's a really interesting theory. It covers some of the things that people have problems with. People, they just find it hard to believe that Elisa is not interacting with someone when she's in that elevator. When she's looking down the hallway and she's gesturing and she's talking, I think people have a real trouble believing that there's no one just out of sight of that camera. So I do think, your theory does a good job of addressing that. And, I could see that. And I think that's one of the reasons that this case is so compelling for so many people. We have just enough evidence to make it interesting, to hook you, to bring you in to the case. And we have just enough evidence that you can build a lot of different theories, a lot of plausible theories. You watch that video and it's so striking. But at the end of the day, you can pick your theory. You can decide this is what you're going to stand on. But while I may not agree with a theory, I may not agree with your theory, it's hard to disprove it. It's basically impossible to disprove it. It's basically impossible to disprove any theory in this case. And I think that's one reason it's so evocative for so many people, because you can go in so many directions and you really can't say, no, that's crazy. And unfortunately, like I said, you can pick your theory and you can decide what you're going to believe, and you can believe what you want to believe, but we're never going to have a definitive answer in this case. We're probably not going to have any more facts than we already have. For the police, the investigation is over in this case. This case is closed. I think it's probably the same for Elisa Lam's parents and her family. I think the only people who are still really looking into this are people from the true crime community. And I doubt, unless someone who was involved comes clean, unless someone out there knows something, unless we have, a deathbed confession in 50 years, who knows? Unless that happens, I think this is going to continue to be a mystery, and it's going to be a mystery that endures for all time. But yeah, I do like the fact that your theory addresses the possibility that she was with somebody else. And I think it's an interesting take that maybe it's not someone who was hostile towards her in any way. It was just, a situation, or it was just possibly a situation where something went horribly wrong. The reason I gravitate to my theory is I like the fact that, provides an explanation for the sand that's on her clothes. And honestly, I think the one thing neither of our theories neglects, and the thing that we can never forget, is the struggle that Elisa Lam had with mental illness.
Yeah, I agree with that. It doesn't necessarily have the ending that some true crime enthusiasts want. But in prosecuting a lot of our cases, we do see, mental illness run a thread through a lot of our cases. And they are very, very difficult and very sad. And I think by spending time talking about it on this podcast, hopefully we're shedding some light on it. And also, I do think it's the most likely theory of what happened here.
And there's a quote from Elisa Lam's blog, and it's, "You're always haunted by the idea you're wasting your life." And I think that's a very poignant quote, particularly for someone who did die so young. And I think the best way for people to ensure that Elisa Lam didn't waste her life and that her life means something is to recognize the symptoms of mental disorder that she was suffering and to take those seriously. And as we said yesterday, not to make up, crazy fantasies about what might have happened to her, but to use her story as an educational tool so that we treat mental illness more seriously and we ensure that people get the help that they need. I think that's the best memorial that we can build to Elisa Lam.
And it's fascinating. And, these are just two theories. There's a lot more theories out there. And maybe one of you can see something that we don't. We've laid out the facts as best as we can see them. And I do think we've done a pretty thorough job. If there's more facts out there that we don't know about, please let us know. But I think we've done a pretty good job of uncovering what's out there.
I think Alice is right. I mean, one of the best things about this community is having the sort of wisdom of the crowd, where a lot of people can bring together facts in a way that, a couple folks can't. So if there are things that that you think we missed, or things that we didn't focus on enough, or things that we read the wrong way, I hope you'll let us know. Email us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Shoot us a tweet @prosecutorspod, or on Instagram @prosecutorspod, or hit us up on the website, prosecutorspodcast.com. As we've said, we're going to put all those documents that we pulled on the website. You guys can read them. You might see something we've missed, something that may strike you differently than it struck us. Maybe there's some legwork you guys can do. I mean, if you're out in the Los Angeles area, there may be leads you can run down that we just couldn't. So if you do have some of that information, let us know.
Take a look at those depositions. Like Brett said earlier, we haven't been able to find them elsewhere posted online. So this may be the first time a lot of you are seeing it. And I know I always enjoy reading depositions because they are under oath and it's written down. So you kind of get to read exactly what they're saying without any sort of mannerisms built into it.
So Alice, it's been a pleasure recording under the blanket today. I hope you've enjoyed the closet. I hope it's been comfortable.
I think it's, at first I was a little bit jealous that you had the nice podcast studio and I was stuck in my closet, but the tables have turned because now I have the more desirable recording location, I believe.
Oh, the tables have definitely turned, my friend. I think during the last episode, I talked about how lucky I was because I was recording from the studio. Man, I was tempting fate.
Well, all I care about is that our podcast equipment is safe. I mean, that you're safe, of course.
Well, thank you.
No, I really am. I really am glad you're safe because that was quite the storm. So we hope all of you listeners are in a safer place than we are. And maybe by the time you listen to this, a vaccine has been discovered for this pandemic.
Hopefully. And maybe I'll have a new roof. Who knows what the future may bring? Hope springs eternal.
There's so much hope in the future.
Anyway, thank you, everybody, for joining us to discuss the mystery of Elisa Lam. Next week, we'll be back with a new case, new questions, and hopefully new answers. But until that time, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
So did you know that when my son was having a tantrum this weekend because, he's now been under lockdown for 45 days at this point, and he's losing his mind, the only way I could get him to stop crying was by singing bow 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 bow, and then he laughs like a crazy person.
Look, music's the best part about this podcast.
Yeah, the music is the best part.